What's the goal of preschool?
For me, the goal of preschool is to give children their first positive experience in an educational system. So I want them to feel good about leaving their parents for the first time, most likely, feeling safe in the care of others, being willing to and having the opportunity to explore new things that they may not be able to explore at home, and have the ability to grow academically, but also socially and emotionally. And so that's what I really wanted. I really wanted, and especially for my children, she didn't really have the opportunity to, explore so many different things and art and finger painting and even getting in an argument with another child, learning that you can't have everything. You need to share, you need to be kind, you need to learn about conflict resolution. It's not all about you all the time.
How do young men like us optimize our lives in a way that lets us achieve success and meaning? Come with me as I interview top performers and delve into key areas of life: habits, finance, psychology, health, relationships, work, creativity, and business. I boil the ocean of men's advice into usable wisdom in this podcast to give you the answers. My name is Blake Bottrell, and this is the Distilled Podcast. My guest today is to some preschoolers what Steve from Blue's Clues was to my 5-year-old self. Thanks to the help of her preschool buds on Amazon Prime and her bibliography of children's books, she regularly helps solve the trials and tribulations of being a toddler. Today, hopefully we can solve some larger problems for you and your kids. With 2 decades of education and parenting experience, she has had front row seat to the evolving landscape of both. From the divestment of parental involvement at school to the hard reality that our parents might have been better at the job than we thought. Danielle Lindner, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, from a childhood development lens, what made Mr. Rogers' surrogate parenting so important for 2 generations of children?
I think for me, I knew as a child who grew up with Mr. Rogers that I always felt safe when I was in front of the television listening to him. And I knew that my parents felt safe leaving me in front of the television listening to him. They were never worried that he was going to say something that they were going to have to unexplain or explain away. They always knew that he would be very cognizant of how lightly to tread on certain subjects and how to speak to children as if they were intelligent human beings, but not above their heads. And so I think that's what really made him so special. And so as an educator, I've tried to and emulate that as much as possible. I mean, he's basically a saint in many ways, so it's sort of hard.
I think this is episode 30 of the podcast, and he must have come up at least 5 or 6 times in 30 episodes. So he's got a pretty good surface area of people's attention when it comes to being the role model that we hoped he would have been. So how do we sort of strike that balance between knowing when to say too much and when not to say too much, or when to explain things to kids as if they know what we're talking about?
So for me, I always think it's a good rule of thumb to ask the child first what questions they have and respond to that because, let's just say we're talking about something really horrific, like a school shooting that they happen to hear about on the news. I wouldn't go up to my child and say, let's talk about the school shooting that happened today. Because maybe they didn't hear all of that. Maybe they just heard something bad happened at a school and they want to know what happened at the school. Why is everybody outside the school? Why is everybody upset about the school? And then, you don't have to mention a lot of the things that could be really upsetting to them and, over their age bracket of understanding. And I think it's good to sort of let your child kind of lead the conversation. and respond to what they're asking about rather than sort of, giving them the whole rundown about, oh, well, the political landscape is such that this and that, and this happened and that happened. And I think, like Mr. Rogers, when you have these bad situations, focus more on the helpers. Yes, something bad happened, but look at all the helpers, which is what he tended to focus on. The good, give kids the hopefully the impression that they live in a safe space, that they're being cared for, that they shouldn't worry. And when they're in school, we do things like lockdowns, and we do things to ready kids for if there was ever an unfortunate situation. But we talk about it in a different way. And you say, oh, there's an animal outside, like, a fox or a cat, and we need to be really quiet so that our helpers can get them to safety. And, that's enough for a little kid. You don't need to really go into too much more unless they come and ask you. And then, just, I say, tread lightly.
It's almost as if Mr. Rogers was the anti-news and the
Yes.
anti-headline. What do you think is the most counterintuitive part of good parenting?
I think parents think that they have to fight every battle, and that they have to stick to a certain boundary that they were told by, say, the books they read or people around them or their parents or their in-laws. And I think I just kind of wrote an article. I wrote an article about the blessing of the second child because I noticed that parents of first time children, I was the same, were very rigid with how they, parent. So I always laid out my daughter's clothes for school. It had to be the perfect outfit with the headband and the matching socks and the matching pants. And, it'd be a little bit of an argument. I don't want to wear that. No, you're wearing this. This is what you need to wear. And then with the second child, I was like, as long as you have pants and a shirt on, I'm fine with it. And, it made life simpler for her and simpler for me. And she ended up going into fashion. So I guess it worked out for her. So I just think, like, sometimes parents think that, there are very strict set of rules to parenting because we're all reading these books, What to Expect When You're Expecting, and Dr. Spock, and there's the calm parent, the stressed parent, there's so many rules of parenting. And I kind of think the best thing is to use your instincts.
I love that you talk about this. The timing of our conversation is a little bit serendipitous because I just finished reading a book by Abigail Schreier called Bad Therapy that came out a month and a half ago. And I wrote in my newsletter this week a 3,500-ish word review of the book. And the basic synopsis of the book is that parents aren't trusting their intuition enough, and that everybody's trying to read 400 different books on parenting or listening to 13 podcasts to try to prep themselves for the kid that's coming. And it was funny. I closed the newsletter with the observation that it's comical that everything that my parents did felt as if it was intuitively the right way to parent, and that every quote unquote parenting expert that has come along in the last 2 decades, 3 decades is in some way missing the mark with what is right for our individual children.
Exactly. Agree 100%. I mean, and the other thing that I think parents will do, and I did it myself, is you compare children. Either you compare your children, if you have more than one, to each other, and you think, oh, why isn't she this way? Because the other one was like that. Why isn't she calm? Why is she so, noisy or rambunctious? Or you compare your children to the other kids at the preschool that you say, oh, well, she's so well behaved, and my child, running all over the place. And I think parents have to realize that there's no normal child. there's just a child and they're all different. And you have to try, as frustrating as some children's behavior can be, because I had a very rambunctious child and a very calm child, you have to try and sit and realize, like, what is the blessings of these things? You know, what are the blessings? So for my one daughter, now they're older, her blessing of being sort of the calm, introspective child is she's going into school psychology, and she's, very focused, and that's gonna be her career. And the other one that was more outgoing, she started a fashion magazine. So, well, it can be frustrating when they're younger because they're not in this little box. I think it's really important to kind of think a couple of steps ahead, think to the future about how is this behavior going to really serve them, because it probably will. If they're talking to everybody and they're a big chatterbox, they're probably going to be social, and maybe they're going to go into sales, and maybe they're going to end up, being a CEO of a company. You never know. So I think that's a big thing. Look ahead, kind of look a couple steps ahead after you get like,
Calm down the brain for a second and look at the individual child. One of the things that kept surfacing in some of your work, and I think is something that I'm going to try to incorporate, is basically what I'll call surface area or exposure. And the idea that absolutely maybe your quiet child is not going into sales, or the rambunctious child is going to be some sort of entertainer of some variety. How do we make sure that we're giving all of these kids the opportunity to be exposed to more things? How can we foster that?
So, when I was young, it was always, if you sign up for something, you need to stay with it, even if you hate it. And so after a while, if you sign up for dance and you're not great at it and you're forced to stick with it, then you kind of say, well, I don't want to try baseball because what if I don't like it? And then I'm stuck with it. I don't want to try art classes because if I don't like it, I'm stuck with it. So I think, and it's a balance because things cost money. And obviously, parents can't pay for a million things and then the child doesn't finish it and then they're paying again. But I think in some ways, if you can, as a parent, allow a child to be somewhat of a butterfly and try a lot of different things so that they can find their passion, I think that's the best way of really exposing them to the world. I mean, in the preschool I started 14 years ago, it was really important for me that we had centers that focused on, science, math, engineering, art, and that everyone went to every center. So because there's a school of thought in certain schools that, I'm not going to say the program, but there's certain programs where it's child led. If a child doesn't want to go to art ever, they never go to art. If they don't ever want to go to the cleaning center, I mean, I wouldn't want to either, but if they don't ever want to go to the cleaning center, they never have to go. And I sort of feel like, how are they going to know that they don't like it or that they love it if they're not kind of pushed a little bit to try? So I think for me, it's all about giving kids a lot of experiences and making it so that if they don't like it, they're not punished for it by having to stay with it. I mean, there is a thing about making a commitment to something, and I think that's a totally different ball game. If you commit to a job or if you commit to volunteer hours, but if you're taking an art class and your child just really doesn't take to it and they'd rather play baseball, I think you should just say, let's try baseball.
Are there any of these sort of low friction entry points you've come across as recurring things as an early childhood educator? Are we looking at like local library programs, like the museum in the local township, trial days for like a kids job fair? Is there something like that that we should be looking out for?
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many free or close to free things that you can do to see if your child's interested in things. So, most programs will have a trial, a 1-day trial. And if they don't, call and say, I think my child wants to do this, but can we just do an hour and just see what it's like? The local museums almost always either, especially if you live in a big city, they're usually free if you live in the city or a few dollars. Take them to see a local exhibit, see if they're really engaged in it, see if they like it and they find it interesting. There's a lot of, when dance schools have their recitals, you can buy a ticket for, they're usually like $10, $12. And even if you don't go to the dance school, go to the recital. Show them like, well, does this seem interesting to you? Does this seem fun? I remember when my kids were little, I used to take them every weekend during the high school musical, time of year. Every weekend we'd go to a different high school and watch their high school musical, and it was really expensive and surprisingly mostly good. And then my younger daughter said, I want to take acting and singing lessons, this looks so fun, and she loved it. So it was like a nice way to dip their toe in it. And the other one said, oh my God, I don't ever want to be on stage, that seems totally horrifying. So it was a good way to dip our toe in, and it wasn't a big commitment, and it was fun. And then it's supportive to your local community and the high school kids that are really working hard to put on something entertaining for the town.
What's the goal of preschool?
For me, the goal of preschool is to give children their first positive experience in an educational system. So I want them to feel good about leaving their parents for the first time, most likely, feeling safe in the care of others, being willing to and having the opportunity to explore new things that they may not be able to explore at home, and have the ability to grow academically, but also socially and emotionally. We saw this a lot during COVID, that so many kids were stuck home or in a very tiny pod with maybe 3 or 4 other children. And even though they might have come into back to preschool at age 3, socially and emotionally, they were still much younger. So I think the preschool experience is so important for those things. And so that's what I really wanted. I really wanted kids, and especially for my children, before I was teaching, I was working a corporate position and I had a nanny, and that was fine. It was great. But she only knew that nanny, or the few little play dates they had. She didn't really have the opportunity to, explore so many different things, and art and finger painting, and even getting in an argument with another child, learning that you can't have everything. Everything, you need to share, you need to be kind, you need to learn about conflict resolution. It's not all about you all the time. So I think those are skills that many adults still haven't learned, but I'm hoping that we can start to teach that in preschool.
There's a little bit of an intersecting point here, and this gets brought up in the book as well. And there's this sort of movement of gentle parenting. And I think the kids are
Yes.
having a little bit of a reality check when they come into preschool, and they've never been told no in their entire life. And they
Yes.
arrive and need to learn how to share. What is the biggest
Mhm.
reality check for the parents in your experience in these cases?
I think there's positives to everything. I do believe that positive behavior management is the most important thing, but there is a way to do it that's not just giving everyone, the key to the candy store. And I was in a restaurant a couple weeks ago, and there was a family sitting around. It was a nice restaurant, and they asked the little boy to please eat his food, and he said no. And he went over to the table next to him that didn't have people on it, and he smashed all the glasses on the ground, all of them. And I really thought that John Quinones was going to come out and say, "What would you do?" Because I was like, what just happened here? This kid is going to definitely get in so much trouble because that is
I would have been made to sit in
horrendous.
the car.
And yes, yes. And you know what happened? They said, "Oh, come on. It's not that bad. If you eat a little bit of your food, we'll give you your tablet back." And I was like, this is definitely an episode of What Would You Do? This can't be real. And it's like, there's, and I was thinking they are doing themselves no favor by not explaining to him why this is not the right behavior in any setting. And they're not doing him any favors either. Because the reality is, we all have to get along. We all have to try and work together. I mean, the problems we have in the world right now are because of those things, because nobody gets along, nobody can have a constructive conversation anymore. Everybody, it's sort of like my opinion or the highway. And this little boy is being basically taught that it's okay. It's okay to do anything you want because you are the best thing in the universe, and nothing should get in the way of that. And I think it's a big disservice. It's a disservice to the child because one day they're going to be in an office and they're going to have to get along. They're going to have to be on a team, most likely, and they're going to have to work with people. And just smashing stuff down and saying no, it's not going to be helpful to him at all. It's also going to be really a big wake up call when this child becomes a teenager for these parents. It's going to be horrendous. I think kids like boundaries, and parents sometimes don't want to set boundaries because they think parents won't love them, the child won't love them, or they won't like me. But the reality is, children feel safer when they have boundaries. They feel safer when the child says no. And when the parent says no, they feel safer when the parent explains to them why it's a no. I think just saying no without an explanation, I don't believe in that. I think children are smarter than people think. And I think you explain to them, you cannot run around the table eating your dinner because you could choke on your food. And that's dangerous. And I love you and I don't want you to get hurt. So that's why we need to sit. I think there's a way to do it that's still positive, but also setting boundaries. And I think boundaries are important. I think that was a long answer for.
It was fantastic. It was exactly the sort of underlying ethos of what I see sort of permeating culture now. There's a section of the book here that talks a little bit about it, and Abigail just says, having surrendered our friendships in adult life for the sake of attending every soccer game, we wanted a small something in return, that our kids tell us everything and make us their best friends. And when you punish, for the duration of that punishment, kids don't give you that. If we acted like actual authorities in our houses, those who don't need to grovel and endlessly explain, we worried we would lose their affection and constant access to everything transpiring in their hearts and minds.
Yeah.
What homework should we be assigning preschool parents?
That's a good question. I think one thing we should assign them is to have non-dinging time. So time without tablets, without TV, and this is really hard. I don't know if I could do it either, but I think it's a good thing to do. No, time where you're unplugged. We're unplugged. We're going to play a board game. We're going to read books. We're going to go outside and play. We're going to take a nature walk. Find something to do, even if it's 15-20 minutes every night before bed, especially, to do something that doesn't give instant gratification, and that kind of, if it is something that also can start a conversation, like reading a book, I think that's a really good homework assignment for parents. And I think another one is for them to put their phones away during meal times and start conversations. I mean, it may be a little hard to have a very in depth conversation with a 2-year-old, but by the time they're 3, you can ask them things about what did you do today? What did you read today? What's your favorite color? Let's count together. Anything that's not on a tablet. And also showing your children that you're giving them your undivided attention. Because I think now very few people ever give anyone undivided attention, whether they're kids or adults.
I saw a clip from a gentleman named Tom Bilyeu. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but he has a podcast now, but he was explaining the concept of, oh, I lied. It wasn't Tom Bilyeu. It's a gentleman named Simon Sinek. And he was giving a presentation in front of a crowd of people and asked to borrow the phone of someone in the audience. And he just continued with his talk with the phone in his hand for a while. And the conclusion of the bit was that basically, if I have this phone anywhere and you're communicating this to your kids too, whether the phone's on the table or it's in your hand, whether you're actively using it, whether you're not actively using it, you are telling the person that you are in the room with that if anything was to happen on this phone, you instantly become second fiddle to whatever could possibly happen here.
Yes.
So even if the phone is away and not being used, you're still subconsciously communicating to the other person that they are less important than whatever could possibly happen that's not you.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny because my daughter just started college and she goes to a place called High Point University in North Carolina. And they have a number of restaurants on campus, and when the students go to eat at the restaurant, they have certain rules because they want to teach them that when you are at a business meeting or you are at an interview where there's a meal, this is how to act. So parents can also go use the restaurant if they're there for the weekend. And my husband and I went to have dinner there. And all of a sudden, we're looking around and we are the only ones with phones on the table and our elbows on the table, too. Now, every student, there was not one phone out, there was not one elbow on the table. They were conversing and they were learning how to be present. And it was amazing. And it was a real big lesson for us. Like, hey, wake up, parents. If these college kids can do it, you can do it. And it's hard because you get into this habit. It's almost like an addiction of having your phone and always having to check your phone. But, they don't allow it in the restaurant. It's not allowed. And they learn how to do it. And I think we kind of have to sort of try and retrain ourselves to do that more and just give our full attention to whatever we're doing or whoever we're with.
I love it. I think there's this fist wagging thing from everybody who seems to think that, oh, back in my day when we didn't have to do, but it's like, I feel
Yeah.
like this is different in some way, in that there's nothing that came before this that was so damaging to attention and interpersonal relationships and just the ability to communicate with other people that we really need to do something and not shoot down the people that just want to be cynical and say that my generation was better. I don't know. That's a long-winded tangent of.
No, but it's so true. I remember when my older daughter was in high school, I walked into her room and both girls were on their phones. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "Oh, we're just texting each other." And I said, "But you're in the same room." And they're like, "It's just easier." I'm like, "No, it's not." What is happening here? Like this is, and another time, it's in my book. We were taking a family vacation to Canada, and we were looking out the window, and it was just gorgeous and like, oh my gosh. And I said, kids, you have to see the mountains. It's just so beautiful. And my youngest said, put it on Instagram. I'll see it later. And I, like, my mind like almost exploded, I think. Like, what is happening? It's funny and sad at the same time.
Bringing us back to the younger children a little bit here. Are there a couple of important pillars that parents should think about when it comes to socializing their toddler?
Pillars. Well, I think getting them in a preschool program is really important. Even if they can't do 5 days a week, if they can do 3 days a week, that's great. The 2 day a week, I think, is really hard for really little kids because separation anxiety is still a really tough thing for a really young child. So, and they really need consistency. So, if you only have them in school Tuesday and Thursday, let's say, they have so many other days where they're not in school that every time it's a school day, it's an adjustment again. So I think if a parent can do at least 3 days with their children, 4 or 5 is ideal. Even if it's a half day, the consistency is really important for growth, for emotional growth, for all of those things. I think it's important to, I call it trickle down education. So if you tell me my child's been very rude, they're disrespectful, they don't have good conflict resolution, I say, how are you when you go out to a restaurant to your server and you don't get your hamburger right? Are you rude? Probably. How are you, when your friends come over, and are you courteous? Are you friendly? Are you hospitable? Maybe not. And how are you with your spouse? Do you yell at each other or do you solve problems by talking it through? Probably not. And I say, your children look to you first. You are their superheroes. And if your superhero is rude and disrespectful and doesn't have good conflict resolution, your child won't either. So I think that's really important, especially for preschool parents. And the other thing is, watch what you say because these kids are really smart. And, if you have a child that's having a difficult time adjusting to school, there's a good chance that you are having a trouble adjusting to them being in school. That it's more about your insecurity and them kind of feeding off of that than them being insecure, because kids are really resilient. They're more resilient than we think. Most often, when you drop your child off at preschool, even if they're crying hysterically, within 5 minutes, they're playing and they're fine. I learned that the hard way by sitting in a parking lot for 30 minutes waiting for my child to stop crying because I was terrified that she was going to cry all day and be so miserable. And for me, I was like, sadly, she didn't really need me after 5 minutes. So, but she could feel the anxiety that I had dropping her off. And she could hear my husband and I, like in the kitchen, saying, I don't know. Do you think she's ready for school? Do you think it's going to be okay? And then the child says, well, if they feel that way, why should I be calm? Why should I enjoy this? So I think that's really important too. Like knowing that they can, it's almost like they're little empaths when they're children, and they can really pick up on you, on your anxiety, and also your joy. So if you pick your child up and you say, was it okay? Was the day all right? Then they think, well, maybe it shouldn't have been so great. But if you reframe it and say, did you have the best day ever? What was your favorite part of the day? Then you're going to get a different answer. So I think those are the main things.
Do you have any tips for parents who are stifling their kids' independence out of their own sort of fear or anxiety?
Yeah, I say, if you have to tiptoe into it, tiptoe into it. So if let's say you've paid for a full-time preschool program, but if you have the benefit of doing 2 hours at a time and that makes you feel more comfortable, do that. And if you can participate in the classroom at all, if they have any, parent participation days, participate so you can see what's going on, so you can feel comfortable with the program. If you're feeling nervous, take a meeting with the teacher or take a meeting with the director of the school and let them know what your anxiety is. Because a lot of times, like when we had anxious parents, we would send them more pictures during the day. We would maybe give them an extra little phone call to give them an update. Sometimes letting the director or the teacher know that you need a little bit more coddling is helpful. And eventually you kind of see it's okay. And then it becomes a little longer and longer. And then it's 6 o'clock and you're like, oh my God, I forgot to pick up my child from school. It actually happens. Eventually it will happen.
Every parent's worst nightmare that happens at least once.
Exactly. I thought John was picking him up. No, I thought you were picking him up.
It's like every single parent movie reference. Maybe this is a good lead into something else here. How do we work on trusting our intuition as parents when the popular culture has sort of fostered this everybody needs to have CPS on speed dial when your definition of good parenting differs from my definition of good parenting? And we're worried about that.
I think we have to spend less time watching TikTok and Instagram about those subjects, as fun as they can be. And I think, we have to remember that instinct was given to us for a purpose. And instinct came from, from the beginning of time to keep us safe and to keep us alive. So it's a blessing to have your instincts. So try and use it more. And, try and push those other voices away as much as you can. It's okay to get advice from people, but I think I see this all the time. I see parents going on Facebook anonymously and they'll say, my child has this horrible rash and I'm not sure what it is. And I think we need to go to a pediatrician, but does anybody have any idea what it is? And I'm saying, already, the mom knows this is a horrible rash. She knows that she needs a pediatrician. Instead, she's going to Facebook to a bunch of people to say, do you have any ideas?
This is worse than
don't do
WebMD.
that. Yeah. Don't do that. Just trust your instinct as a mom. Go to the urgent care. It may not be as quick or as cheap as Facebook, but it's certainly going to be a lot more accurate.
I'm pretty sure just about everything out there is more accurate than Facebook. So
I like to call it Dr. Google.
along this sort of line here, I think there's a lot of working moms or prospective working moms, yourself included. And it feels to me as though a lot of people have been sold this idea that family is sort of this nice to have thing on the side of their career. How do we sort of pull back that messaging and say that it's okay to be a mom first, or it's okay to think that your mom duties are ahead of your career? And I know I'm trying not to stereotype a lot of people here, but this is something that I've heard from more than one person when it comes to how they think about where they're supposed to be in their late 20s or early 30s when it comes to this conversation.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it comes to like you have to look inside yourself and decide, first of all, before you even have children, do I really want to be a mom or do I not want to be a parent? And I really do respect people who say, no, I really don't want to be a parent, because being a parent really does mean putting someone else before you forever if you're a good one. And I respect people who said, you know what, my wife and I just decided parenting wasn't for us. We wanted to do our own thing. We wanted to travel. We wanted to just focus on our career. And that was what we wanted for ourselves. And I respect that, because if they had children, just because everyone says you need to have kids to be a family, those would have probably been very sad, lonely children. And I think that's worse. As a mom, I know for myself, I've been very fortunate to always be an entrepreneur when I had my children. So I could decide how I wanted to schedule my workday so that if, it was the kindergarten graduation, I was there. If it was, some sort of special mommy and me thing, I could be there. And, it probably meant working after they went to sleep at night, but that was the choice for me. And I think a lot of it is when you decide on your career and you decide you do want to be a mom, being really honest with yourself and your employer that I am committed to this. I want to be this international banker, let's say, but if my child is sick, I'm going to be home with them. If my child graduates from kindergarten, just know I won't be flying to Japan for that meeting. I'm going to be at their kindergarten graduation. And if they say that doesn't work for me, then look for another employer, because I think there are plenty of employers that really do value work-life balance, and they do see that it's important that they're going to get the best out of you if you give them that leeway and that balance. I mean, I know I give 120% every other moment so that I can have those few moments for my kids and their special things. And I think more employers need to realize that if you do treat people that way, moms, especially who are caregivers, are going to care for your company and your position more than anything. They're going to give you so much more if you just respect that they're a mom or a dad, mom or dad.
I like that. I think I can't remember where I heard it. I believe it might have been something to do with a Gary Vaynerchuk runs a like quarterly marketing podcast where he brings in his CMO and a bunch of other guests, and they talk about various different topics. But I think on one of these, I remember one of the guests talking about their favorite type of employee being a mom of like teen kids or recently graduated kids, because like you were saying, they are those caregivers and they have that maternal instinct to care for the kids, and because of that have developed these amazing skills of being able to manage people or care for whatever part of your business that you can slot them into or where they're most effectively used. So I think that's a great analogy there, to be able to really make sure you're vetting your employer when it comes to making these career choices and life choices, more importantly.
I remember I was helping a friend. She'd been a stay at home mom for like 15 years while her kids were growing up, and she wanted to get back into the workforce. And she said, but and she wanted to go back into finance where she was. And she said, but I don't have any skills anymore. I wasn't working in an office. So I said, okay, but you were the treasurer of the PTA for 5 years, handling lots of money, lots of fundraisers, so many, admission to different events. Is that you were the head of the Girl Scouts running the cookie drive. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of coordination. I said, basically, you've been a consultant, a financial consultant and controller for the past 15 years. It just wasn't working in an office. And you've done basically 5 jobs at once, all very well. Where can somebody find an employee like that? That's amazing. And I said, so you're going to put on your resume that you were a consultant for the last 15 years doing all of these various things. And they hired her, and she's now like a vice president or something, like, because When you're a mom, you are multitasking like nobody's business. And multitasking is great for a company's return on investment. If you can only do one thing before you can do another thing, a lot of things fall by the wayside, but moms are pretty good at getting a lot done quickly and accurately, like filling out camp forms for 2 children and running a cookie drive. There are a lot of things that happen at home with the children.
I love this sort of thinking outside the box mentality. I had another woman on the podcast named Samantha Postman who talks a lot about the importance of sort of breaking rules or dodging rules in creative ways to be ahead or around of what society expects, but in a good way. So this thinking outside the box of, yeah, you ran the PTA, but you were really just a controller and a financial analyst. That is entirely lines up with the ethos that she explained to me about the story of her daughter circumventing all of undergrad because she went and taught English in Costa Rica for a year and then ended up getting accepted to this post-grad program later because she had all of this teaching and writing skill already. So I think being able to think about things creatively in that way is a fantastic asset to anyone looking to go back and re-enter the workforce.
Yeah, we actually start that in our preschool. We call it divergent thinking exercises. And we at circle time will have a brown paper bag, and in the bag's always something different. So it could be a paper clip. And if you show up a paper clip to an adult and say, "What can you use this for?" They're going to say, "Put 2 pieces of paper together." But when you start the divergent thinking exercises, the brain starts to really exercise itself at a young age. And they say a fishing line, a necklace, a jump rope, or you give them, a brick and they're like, oh, it could be like a pencil holder. It could be a plant thing. It could be so many things. And I think teaching kids to think outside the box and trying to keep it going through, high school, which is the hard part because you become much less of a divergent thinker the more you go through school. But if we could try and harness that somehow into adulthood, then I think we would have a lot more of these creative alternatives to things.
Is there an advantage of starting that in preschool of not having learned what the box is yet?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's kind of sad and scary how things change so rapidly. Actually, my daughter did some research, undergrad research on like sense of self and better than average effect. And they found that children from like 2 to 3 felt that they were better than their friends. They were better at art, or they were nicer. They were just better than average. And as soon as you got to age 4 or 5, that dramatically dropped. I'm not as good as my friend. I'm not as smart as my friend. I'm probably not as nice as my friend. And they asked me, as an educator, how do you explain this? And I said, because once you get to 4 or 5, you start assessing. You start doing formal assessments, which we all, testing. And now, then, the SAT and all this other business. And as soon as we start assessing each other, we start losing that ability to feel creative and better and good about ourselves. And that's why I really don't like the SAT, which is way beyond preschool, but I just think like it really, just because you're a good test taker doesn't mean that you're really super intelligent. It doesn't really mean that. And just because you're a terrible test taker doesn't mean that you're not a genius. Some people have test anxiety, and kids, the older they get, the more aware they become of this. And it's sad because it really happens at a young age, really fast.
Yeah, I think the transition from the sort of play-based learning that happens prior to kindergarten coming into grade 1. I haven't done a deep dive on any of this stuff, but my passing knowledge is that there's a lot of sort of terrible things that happen when you make a kid sit in a desk for 6 to 8 hours a day. And I can say that that certainly maps onto my experience of schooling, at least in some part, especially in the elementary education. I think I finally figured it out by the time I got to middle and high school, but my elementary learning was challenged by the fact that I was a very energetic child, and that was much to the behest of some of my teachers. So
Yeah. And the traditional way to handle that was timeout or the red, yellow, green light system where, if you're on red now, so don't even try to redeem yourself. You're on red light. And that stuff just it's just so infuriating because it doesn't really help a child. So we have a program, we have a like a way of doing things at our preschool. So if there's a child that, and there's a lot of kids that have ADHD, they just do. It's very prevalent. I think it was always around. We just didn't know what it was. We just thought ADHD was the child that was the jokester in class that just couldn't sit still. We didn't have diagnoses for certain things. And so there are some kids that can't sit in a circle for 10 minutes without being fidgety, and it's torturous for them. It's not that they're trying to be bad, they just can't do it. So in our classrooms, we say, if you feel that you need to go sit, on the corner carpet and play with the stuff in the basket for a little while, or color a little bit, or play with a fidget spinner, do that. And when you feel like you can come back and sit, come back. And it gives kids some stewardship over themselves, and it makes them so that they're not shamed and they don't feel bad for something that they really can't control. And I think we need to do more of that.
I've heard you talk a little bit about parents sort of actively disengaging from the education system over the last 10, 20 years. Have you been able to gather any insight as to what's sort of causing that trend?
Yeah, I have seen that so much. And I don't, I can't really put my finger on what it is other than the fact that as the years have gone on, it's that technology instant gratification thing again. And I think parents, if they are working, for a company or something where there's somebody that's always wanting something from them, they're never off. And so they're coming to pick up and they're getting a text from their boss, or they're responding to an email in their car before pickup, or, they're just always feeling like they're on all the time. So I think that's one of the things. I think there's also just a level of entitlement that has happened. I don't know if it's what generation it started, but there's like they said, the 80s was the me generation, and I'm starting to see a little bit more of that again too, especially I think with Instagram and all these things where people think that everybody has more than them, everybody's happier than them, everyone is prettier than them, everyone's better than them because they're just looking at their Instagram post. And so it's about, I don't have time to deal with this school stuff. I'm paying for you to take care of my child. And this is not every parent. There are many parents that are super engaged and totally amazing. But the ones that aren't, it's like, look, I only have a few years to get to this spot. And you take care of my child so that during the day I can make the money. I can be the Kardashian, I can be everything that I should be based on everyone else's Instagram. And it's really funny because someone told me once that whenever you see a couple on Instagram that constantly posts their lovey-dovey relationship, they're always the most miserable ones.
I listen to a podcast all the time that's called Modern Wisdom, And one of the ideas that the host Chris keeps floating is this idea that the overcompensation effect for, he has a much cleaner name for it, but basically the idea is that whatever people portray in public is an overcompensation for something that's happening under the surface, whether you're saying on Instagram and people are miserable behind the scenes, or whether it's the like late night hosts or the TV hosts that were came out to be kind of tyrants to work for, and they're the most bubbly ones
Yep.
on television. So it's one of those things that I think, yeah, we just have to be wary of. And I think coming full circle back to the entitlement Instagram side of things, we just have to make sure that we're not losing the plot on the fact that like your kids are a large part of your life, and sacrificing 5 years or 10 years or 15 years of your life and dealing with your kids for those years, you're not getting them back. And by the time you're done with those 15
Right.
years, maybe your son or daughter doesn't want to talk to you anymore because you didn't put in the time to start with. And I think that's a
Exactly.
regret of a lot of entrepreneurs and high earning executives that I hear, is that, yeah, if I could do it all over again, I would have worked less hard and hung out with my kids more.
Yeah. There was one event when my older daughter was in third grade. It was like some dentist thing where like they made teeth and you were supposed to come and, do the dentist thing with her. And I didn't go because I didn't think it was really the most important thing. It was just, it didn't, I mean, it wasn't billed as like, oh, everyone show up to this thing. But I went to everything else. And she's 24 now and she still says, why didn't you come to the dentist thing? So I get it. I'm like, I went to everything else. So with the second one, I went to the dentist thing. I went to everything, every possible thing, because I did not want to miss out. Also, you want to give an example to your children about how you think they should be as parents. If you're supportive parent, if you try and do the best for them, if you are objective, if you listen, if you say things to them, especially when they're little, like, I understand why this might make you feel this way, but we're not going to be able to do this today because of whatever, but I understand why you feel sad. Like, if you acknowledge them, if you treat them almost like little human adults, then they're going to become better parents too. And I think that's important, because you see, like, a lot of children that come from abusive homes, they become abusive. So it works the other way too. If you can be a really kind and courteous and loving and caring and present parent, most likely your children will become those parents too.
What's been your most positive observation lately about the changing educational landscape?
For me, I think it's been the acknowledgement of, like, accepting neurodivergent learners, accepting children that have learning differences, not saying they have learning challenges. Teachers being more willing to change their approach to teaching rather than trying to say this child shouldn't be in my classroom. I think that's been the biggest, greatest thing that's happened. And it's been slow coming. But I think now we're finally seeing that, and we're finally realizing that just because a child might have an auditory processing disorder or ADHD or whatever, it does not mean that they should not be in the classroom with the other children. And it doesn't mean that they're a behavior issue. It means that maybe they are learning differently. So let's try some other approaches to help them. And I think that's really good character building. It's also character building for the other children to say, how can we help him? He's struggling a little bit. Maybe could you sit with him and maybe read it to him again because it's hard for him to hear? Or, you know, it's good to just, I think it's good for everybody in the classroom. And that's been the biggest change I've seen, I think, in the educational system that I really love.
I have one final question that I like to ask all my guests, and it's to embrace this idea of exploring novel ideas and having good conversations again. And that's what's the last thing that you changed your mind about?
Last thing I changed my mind about, like in
Maybe
general,
you've got
for
a new
everything
ice
in
cream
my whole
flavor
life.
or you've got a new take on the economy. Anything in between.
The last thing I changed my mind about was when I pass, where I want to be buried. I told my children, just bury me by the Four Seasons Hotel backyard because I know you'll want to visit me.
Danielle, I love it.
You go, or the Short Hills Mall, whatever. Either's fine.
Danielle, I love it. If we want to send people to find your stuff, where can they go?
They can go to DanielleLindner.com. It's DanielleLindner.com.
Perfect. I appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, and it's great to chat.
Thank you for having me.